tense hospital night, a scared child, a tired but unusually compassionate nurse, a priceless moment of kindness witnessed by someone powerful and silently grieving. What he saw would not only shake his assumptions, but forever change too. Lives *. It was nearly 2 a.m. in the dimly lit pediatric ICU of Brookshire Memorial Hospital. The corridors, usually humming with movement, now stood eerily quiet. Only the gentle beep of monitors and the low hiss of the ventilator whispered through the silence. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting pale shadows on the sterile floors. The world outside was asleep, but inside room 217, time had paused. 8-year-old Sophie Langston lay restless in her hospital bed. Her thin arms curled around her chest as she stared at the ceiling. Her chest rose and fell unevenly, not just from the sickness in her lungs, but from the fear she didn't know how to speak out loud. Her hair, once thick and golden, now thinned beneath a cotton cap, and her eyes, once full of light, seemed dimmed by weeks of pain, treatments, and the loneliness that came in waves. "I don't want to close my eyes," she murmured, barely loud enough to be heard. Elena Reyes, the night shift nurse, paused mid-step and turned back toward the bed. She had just been about to leave to check on another patient, but something in Sophie's voice pulled her like a thread. Tiredness tugged at her every limb. This was hour 11 of a 12-hour shift, but her heart wouldn't let her walk away. "You don't have to sleep if you don't want to," Elena said softly, walking back and kneeling beside Sophie's bed. Her voice was warm, gentle like sunlight trying to peek through storm clouds. Sophie's bottom lip quivered. "What if I don't wake up?" Elena's breath caught, just slightly. It wasn't the first time she'd heard that question from a child, but it always landed the same in the quiet place where her own pain still lived. She smiled gently, brushing a lock of hair from Sophie's damp forehead. "Then we make sure that tonight is full of love and courage. So much of it, that it follows you into your dreams and brings you right back in the morning," she whispered. Sophie didn't answer. Her fingers curled tighter into the blanket, and a single tear slipped down the side of her face. Elena reached into her tote bag by the wall. She paused, fingers hovering over something she hadn't touched in years, something she had sworn she'd never part with. Slowly, she pulled out a small cloth doll-fated pink dress, one shoe missing, hair made of thick yarn tied in an old ribbon. Its fabric had worn thin in places, and its smile had been resewn twice. Elena held it carefully in both hands, like a treasure made of memory and hope. Sophie turned her head. Her eyes widened just a little. "She's called Hope," Elena said, placing the doll gently on the bed. "She was mine. My mom gave her to me when I was in the hospital. I was about your age. I held her so tight every night I thought she might burst, but she never did. She stayed strong for me." "She's really old," Sophie said, but there was no insult in her voice, just awe. Elena chuckled softly. "She is, but old things can carry big stories. She's been through everything with me, every hard night, every tear, every little victory, and I think she wants to be with you tonight." Sophie looked uncertain. "What if I break her?" "You won't," Elena said. "She's tougher than she looks, just like you." Sophie blinked at the doll for a moment longer. Then, without a word, she reached out and took it in her arms. Her breathing slowed. Her shoulders, once tensed with fear, began to relax. A few moments later, her eyes finally fluttered closed. She whispered something into the doll's ear, something only she and Hope would ever know. Elena stood up slowly, stretching her back. She didn't notice the shadow just outside the glass door. She didn't know she was being watched or across the hallway. Partially hidden in the dim corridor, a tall man stood completely still. He wore a tailored overcoat and polished shoes, a soft leather briefcase still in one hand. His other hand pressed gently against the cold glass as he looked inside. His expression was unreadable, part surprise, part something deeper. Alexander Langston, billionaire investor, tech innovator, and Sophie's father had arrived straight from the airport. A business emergency had pulled him out of town for 3 days, and although he had raced to get back, guilt weighed heavier than the jet lag. He hadn't expected to find anyone sitting with Sophie at this hour. He hadn't expected to see a nurse kneeling beside her bed, offering her something so personal, something so obviously irreplaceable. He saw how the child clutched the worn doll to her chest, how her little hands curled around it like it was the most precious thing she'd ever touched. He saw the look on the nurse's face, the kindness that asked for nothing in return, and suddenly, For reasons he couldn't quite name, he couldn't bring himself to step inside the room. This was not a moment for him, not yet. It was a moment between two hearts, one small, one weary, that had found each other in the dark, and he would never forget it. His phone buzzed in his pocket, another reminder of the world that always demanded his attention. He didn't check it. For the first time in a long while, the only thing that seemed urgent was watching his daughter fall asleep with peace in her heart, and the woman who had made it possible. He didn't know it yet, but everything in his life was about to change, not because of money, not because of power, but because, in that quiet moment, he had witnessed something he hadn't believed in for years: selfless kindness. And sometimes, all it takes to rebuild a broken world is one heart choosing to care, even when no one is watching. But someone was. And that changed everything. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the hospital corridor, soft and golden, casting light onto the polished floors and quietly announcing a new day. The world had turned overnight, as it always does. Unaware that within the walls of Brookshire Memorial, something quietly powerful had taken root. Alina walked out of room 217, her steps slower than usual. Her shift was over, but her mind lingered. She glanced back once more at Sophie, still sleeping peacefully, arms wrapped tightly around the doll. That image stayed with her like a song she couldn't stop humming. There was something about the way Sophie had clung to that old, tattered piece of cloth, as if in that moment she had believed in something again: safety, magic, love, maybe all of them at once. As Alina stepped into the staff lounge to clock out, she passed another nurse on the morning shift, who raised an eyebrow at the doll still resting in Sophie's arms. "Alina," the nurse said, a little amused, "did you give her your childhood doll?" Alina offered a faint smile. It felt like the right thing. "You know, most kids don't even notice those kinds of things," the other nurse said, half laughing. "They're too used to getting whatever they want." "She's not most kids," Alina replied gently, slipping her badge into her coat pocket, "and I think she needed to believe someone cared more than she needed a new toy." The moment she stepped out into the brisk morning air, Alina drew in a long breath. There was a kind of clarity that only came after sleepless nights, when your mind was too tired to put up defenses and your heart got to speak more freely. She didn't know what had made her give away that doll. Maybe it was the look in Sophie's eyes, or maybe it was something deeper, something that had been waiting for the right child to come along. Either way, it was done. What she didn't know was that, just minutes earlier, Alexander Langston had stepped into the same hospital room. He moved carefully, as if not to disturb the peace that lingered in the air. His eyes softened at the sight of his daughter still fast asleep, her small fingers curled around the doll's sleeve. He sat quietly in the chair Alina had left behind. Sophie stirred and opened her eyes. "Daddy, I'm here, sweetheart," he whispered, brushing a lock of hair from her forehead. "You were asleep when I came in." Sophie's voice was hoarse, but calm. "She gave me her doll." "I saw," Alexander said. He didn't mention he had been watching the night before. He didn't know how to explain the way that moment had settled inside him like a stone in water, rippling slowly, deeper than he expected. "She said it was magic," Sophie murmured. Alexander didn't smile, but something in his chest flickered. "Do you believe her?" Sophie looked at the doll and nodded. "I didn't feel so scared anymore." He nodded back. No spreadsheets, contracts, or negotiations had ever offered him a truth as simple or as profound as what his daughter had just said. Later that morning, after Sophie had fallen back asleep, Alexander requested to meet Alina. He didn't tell the hospital administrator why, only that he had a personal matter to discuss. A favor, they assumed, or maybe a complaint, though that seemed unlikely. When Alina was called to the administrator's office, she arrived unsure, and still wearing her wrinkled night shift scrubs. She found him standing by the window, hands folded behind his back, staring out at the hospital parking lot, as if it were a boardroom view. He turned when she entered. For a second, neither of them spoke. Alina recognized him immediately. His face was occasionally in the news, often attached to words like visionary, tycoon, CEO, but he looked different now. Less composed, less polished, more human. "You're Alina Reyes," he said. "Yes, sir." He walked toward her and paused, his eyes scanning her face, not with the cold scrutiny of a businessman, but with quiet respect. "You stayed with Sophie last night." "I did," she said, unsure where this was going. "You gave her your doll." Alina hesitated. Yes, why? There was no accusation in his tone, just a genuine question. Alina shifted slightly, folding her hands, because she was terrified, and because I knew what it felt like to lie in a hospital bed at that age, and not know if your parents were coming back. Alexander's expression changed, just slightly, like something painful had passed through him. She didn't tell me she was scared, he said quietly. She didn't have to, Alina replied. Sometimes children need more than medicine. They need to feel safe, loved, seen. There was a pause, a long one. I watched you, he finally admitted. Last night, through the glass. You didn't know I was there. Alina felt her heart give a small, involuntary skip. But he didn't continue with an apology or a justification. What you did, he began again. I haven't seen anyone do that in a long time. You gave her something you couldn't replace. I didn't expect anything in return, she said gently. I know, he said. That's why it mattered. The room fell quiet again, this time not with tension, but with understanding. Like to offer you something, he continued. A position, a different kind of role. I'm establishing a foundation for pediatric care. Real care, not just clinical treatment, but the kind of emotional support you gave my daughter. I want you to help lead it. Alina blinked. Sir, I'm just a nurse. You're not just anything, he interrupted. You reminded my daughter how to be brave, and reminded me what it means to truly care for someone. Alina was speechless. You don't have to say yes now, he added, but think about it. You've changed someone's life already. I think you could do that for hundreds more. She nodded, her voice still caught in her throat. I'll think about it. As she walked out of the office, back into the noise and shuffle of the hospital, her mind spun. This was not a door she had ever expected to open. And yet, something in her heart whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was where her path had been leading all along. Across the building, in room 217, Sophie clutched her doll and whispered to it again. She didn't know that her dad had watched that moment, or that the nurse who had given her that doll might soon help thousands of children feel what she had felt that night, safe, brave, loved, and none of them, not Alina, not Sophie, not Alexander, knew that this was only the beginning of something far bigger than any of them could imagine. But the seed had been planted, and it was already beginning to grow. The soft rustle of wind passed through the tall pines that lined the edge of the hospital courtyard. Birds fluttered overhead, chirping into the early afternoon, and somewhere in the distance, the faint chime of a bell tower echoed across the campus. It was the kind of peaceful scene few noticed, especially those consumed by the daily weight of sickness and healing. But in that quiet patch of sunlight, Alexander Langston sat on a bench that felt colder than it should have been, staring down at his phone but not reading a single word on the screen. The world of business didn't pause for reflection, but he had, for the first time in years, he'd willingly silenced his calls, missed a meeting, postponed a deal, not because he didn't care, but because something inside him had begun to shift, a realization that success, for all its reward, had never taught him what truly mattered, until one quiet night, on the other side of hospital glass, he watched Sophie through the window. Her face lit with a calm he hadn't seen in months. The doll still sat at her side. That tiny, worn figure had done what his wealth couldn't. It had comforted her. It had reminded her that someone was willing to give everything they had, even the things they cherished most, for no reason other than kindness. Alina Reyes. The name stayed on his mind like an echo that refused to fade. Back inside the hospital, Alina was finishing another long shift, this one different from any other. Everywhere she went, someone seemed to look at her just a second longer. A few nurses smiled knowingly. One doctor nodded with more respect than usual. Word had gotten around that she had been asked into the hospital administrator's office by Alexander Langston himself. Rumors took flight quickly in tight-knit places like this, but Alina didn't walk with a sense of pride. If anything, she felt more uncertain than ever. She had returned to Sophie's room before the shift ended. The girl had asked if Hope, her doll, could talk to her nurse again. She said thank you, Sophie whispered with a smile. Alina knelt beside her. Did she? Sophie nodded. She said I can give her to someone else once I'm strong enough. Elena's eyes welled, but she blinked the tears back quickly. That sounds exactly like something she'd say. In truth, the idea of that doll passing on again, being held by another small, frightened child, gave Alina a sense of purpose she hadn't known she was looking for. Later that evening, as she exited through the back staff door, Alexander was waiting. He stood there, dressed down for once in a grey sweater and jeans, looking almost like any other father leaving the hospital after a long day, except for the hesitation in his stance, as if unsure whether she'd be willing to speak again. "I hope this isn't too forward," he said as she approached, "but would you walk with me?" Alina hesitated, then nodded. "All right." They made their way along the sidewalk that curved around the edge of the hospital garden, the air crisp but not cold. For a while, they said nothing. Birds darted through the trees above them. The world felt surprisingly alive. "I've been thinking," Alexander began, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. "I've built a lot of things in my life. Companies, networks, futures, some people would say. But I never built something that made a child feel safe when the lights went out." Alina glanced sideways, unsure what to say that night. He continued, "I realized I'd been trying to save my daughter with efficiency, structure, control. I'd given her doctors, treatments, and the best medical care money could buy. But not once had I thought to give her comfort." Alina nodded slowly. "You were doing the best you knew how." "I don't think I was," he said quietly. "I was surviving, but she needed more." They stopped near a tree where golden leaves had begun to gather in piles. He turned to face her. "I meant what I said about starting something different, a foundation, not just a funding pipeline or a name on a wall, but something that makes a real impact. Places where nurses are empowered to sit beside scared children, where no one times compassion by the hour." Elena's breath caught. "And I want you to help me build it," he said, his voice steady now. "I want you to help shape it, not as a nurse following orders, but as someone who understands what true care feels like. Someone who gives when there's nothing left to give." She stared at him, heart pounding. "I'm not used to being asked to lead things. That's why I'm asking," he said with a soft smile. "The ones who never expect to lead often do it best." There was a long pause. "I don't know how to run a foundation," she admitted. "You'll learn," he said. "We'll learn together." For the first time in a long time, Alina allowed herself to imagine something new. A life not just of 12-hour shifts and late-night emergencies, but one where her actions reached farther. One where hope wasn't just a dull past, from hand to hand, but a mission, a movement. She nodded slowly. "Okay, I'll try." "You won't be alone," he said. The wind picked up around them, leaves fluttering like confetti. And just like that, the partnership began, not out of strategy or opportunity, but out of the simplest act of human grace. People from different worlds, one shaped by boardrooms and balance sheets, the other by late nights and quiet courage, deciding that together they could build something better. And not far away, in a hospital bed, a little girl slept peacefully. The doll resting at her side seemed to smile to dot something had begun. Not a charity, not a project, a mission of heart, and it was only just beginning. The cold light of early winter crept into the corners of Alexander Langston's downtown office, soft and grey, painting the walls with quiet shadows. The space, once a shrine to achievement, now felt different, not diminished, but redefined. Where plaques and photos once dominated the shelves, a framed picture of Sophie had found a new home on his desk. She was holding the doll, her smile subtle but real, eyes brighter than they had been in months. Alexander ran his fingers over the edge of the picture frame, lost in thought. For years, his world had revolved around precision deadlines, deals, quarterly margins, but the experience with Alina and Sophie had pulled a thread he hadn't realized was woven so tightly through his life. Now it was unraveling, not into chaos, but into something far more honest, more human. The foundation he'd promised to create was no longer an abstract idea, it was real. Meetings were scheduled, resources were in motion, a team was slowly forming. And at the center of it all was Alina Reyes. She had reluctantly accepted his offer, not out of ambition, but because something about the vision had resonated with her spirit. She wasn't chasing recognition, she was chasing purpose. And maybe, in a way she hadn't said out loud, she was chasing healing, both for others and for herself. Their first planning meeting took place in a modest conference room overlooking a quiet park. Nothing extravagant, just a table, a whiteboard, and a scatter of notebooks. Alexander had invited doctors, therapists, child life specialists, and Alina, seated quietly among them, not in scrubs this time, but in a soft grey sweater and jeans. She looked out of place among executives, but her presence silenced the room with a quiet authority none of them had expected. When she spoke, people listened. "We always talk about healing the body," she said, her voice gentle but clear. But no one trains us to heal fear. Children don't always have the words to say they're scared. They just cry, or they hide, they act out, and we medicate it or ignore it. But what they need is safety, real safety. Someone who stays, someone who sees them. One of the doctors leaned forward, curious. And how do we build that into a system? Alina glanced at Alexander. We don't start with systems, we start with stories. We find the nurses and caregivers who have been doing this quietly for years, unnoticed. We asked them what they needed, and never got. We built from there. There was a pause, thoughtful, respectful. It was the beginning of a movement, a subtle shift from structure to soul. Over the weeks that followed, they began visiting hospitals first, locally, then in neighboring towns, not as critics, but as learners. Alina met night shift nurses who kept journals to remember their young patients' birthdays. She met a janitor who drew smiley faces on the fogged windows of the pediatric wing every morning, just to make the kids laugh. She saw people who gave in invisible ways, every single day. But she also saw places where care had become mechanical, where policies had replaced compassion, where overworked staff barely looked up from their charts. And in those places, she left notes, suggestions, encouragement. She never pointed fingers. She simply said, "We can do better." At one hospital they met a young boy named Mason, 7 years old, newly diagnosed with leukemia. He refused to speak, refused to eat. The staff had tried everything: games, therapy dogs, even a magician. Alina sat with him for nearly an hour, saying almost nothing, just drawing beside him, quietly, patiently. She let him see that she wasn't there to fix him, entertain him, or bribe him. She was just there, and at the end of that hour, Mason picked up a blue crayon and drew a heart on her page. No words, just that dot, and Alina looked up and smiled. "That's beautiful." Alexander watched from the hallway again, just as he had with Sophie, but this time, he wasn't a bystander. He was a student. Later that night, he asked her, "How did you know what he needed?" She shrugged softly. "I didn't. I just let him show me." "Not everyone can do that," he said. "Everyone could," she replied, "if we gave them the time, the space, the support." And there it was, the blueprint for the foundation, wrapped not in statistics or policy, but in a heart-shaped crayon mark. Soon, they started training modules for hospital staff, not about medicine, but about presence, listening, empathy, noticing. They called it Project Hope's Hand, named after the doll that started it all. And at the center of every presentation, they told Sophie's story, not to inspire pity, but to awaken something. Each time they showed a photo of the doll, old and ragged, but full of meaning. Someone in the room teared up. Sometimes a nurse, sometimes a senior administrator. Once, a surgeon who hadn't cried in 20 years. They didn't realize it at first, but they weren't just building a program. They were building a movement, a quiet one, a necessary one. And though the media hadn't yet caught wind of what was happening, something else was taking notice. The families, the children, the caregivers. At one event, a mother approached Alina, her eyes glistening. "My daughter was in your care 3 years ago," she said. "You probably don't remember, but you braided her hair before her surgery, and you told her she was strong." Alina did remember, the woman continued. "She still talks about you." That was the first time in her life she believed she was anything other than sick. Alina stood frozen, a lump rising in her throat. And that night, as she sat in the back seat of the car, while Alexander drove them back into the city, she whispered, "Maybe this is what I was meant to do." Alexander didn't respond right away. He looked ahead, the city lights stretching out before them like stars fallen to earth. "Maybe it's what we were both meant to do," he said. And in the silence that followed, neither of them realized that far beyond the city, across miles of hospital corridors and waiting rooms, a small ripple of change was becoming a wave, not of power, not of wealth, but of care, true care, the kind that starts with a doll in a child's hands and grows into something no amount of money can ever buy, the kind the world had almost forgotten, until now. Snow had begun to fall, quietly at first, just a soft dusting that kissed the pavement and rooftops of the city, the kind of snowfall that seemed to hush the world, as if nature itself were leaning in to listen more closely. Somewhere deep in the heart of downtown, on the top floor of a modest brick building that had once been a printing press, warm light spilled from the windows of the newly opened headquarters of Project Hope's hand, that it had taken months to find the right place. Not something extravagant, but something with soul. Exposed brick, tall windows, a creaky staircase that sounded like it remembered every footstep it had ever held. Alina had insisted on the space. "This building has heart," she said the first time they toured it. Alexander, ever the strategist, had hesitated at first, but standing there in the amber light, hearing the echo of her footsteps on old wooden floors, he saw it to dot now. Desks were arranged in soft clusters. Shelves lined the walls, not with binders and policy documents, but with framed letters from patients, photos of families, drawings from children who once refused to speak. There was even a shadow box mounted near the entrance inside it. The original doll, worn, faded, still missing one button eye, the symbol of it all. That morning, Alina arrived before anyone else. She always did. She liked the quiet before the buzz of the day, when she could pour her coffee slowly and let the stillness wrap around her. But today, her calm was stirred by something different. A letter. It had been slipped under the door, handwritten, in looping cursive. No return address, no postage. She unfolded it gently. "You don't know me, but my daughter was admitted to St. Augustine's last year. She was so scared, she wouldn't speak for days. One night, a nurse stayed with her past midnight, humming songs and holding her hand. My daughter said it was the first time she didn't feel invisible. That nurse gave her something no medicine ever could. I just wanted you to know because I think you were that nurse, and we've never forgotten it." It wasn't signed. Alina held the letter to her chest for a long moment, eyes closed. Some things didn't need signatures to be felt. Later that morning, the team gathered in the conference room. 10 people, all from different backgrounds: pediatric nurses, social workers, child life specialists, a retired principal, even a soft-spoken artist who had spent years drawing murals in children's hospitals. And, of course, Alexander. They were finalizing plans for a new initiative, a traveling program that would send comfort specialists into hospitals across underserved communities. Not consultants, not overseers, just real people trained to do one thing: stay. Stay when others had to leave. Stay when the fear crept in. Stay long enough to matter. The room buzzed with ideas: how to scale, how to fund, how to recruit. But halfway through the meeting, stood up and quietly walked to the window. The snow was falling harder now, and with her back to the group, she said, "We're building something beautiful, but it's not enough to build it. We have to protect it from becoming just another project." They all turned toward her. "We can't let the heart get buried under the paperwork. We have to keep the stories at the center, always." Alexander watched her carefully. She had grown in this role, not into someone new, but more fully into herself. Still the same nurse who stayed past her shift, but now standing taller, her voice firmer, her reach extending far beyond any single hospital room. He nodded slowly. "Then let's write the stories into the walls." And that's what they did. In the coming weeks, they launched an initiative called the Wall of Hands. At every hospital their team visited, they would invite patients, families, and staff to leave their handprint on a mural accompanied by a single word: hope, brave, loved, seen, not alone. The murals grew quickly, colorful waves of fingerprints stretching across sterile white walls, and with each handprint, another reminder: someone had been there, someone had mattered. One day, in a rural clinic miles from the city, Alina stood watching a young boy press his tiny hand into green paint. He looked up at her and whispered, "Can I write 2 words instead of 1? "Of course," she said, kneeling beside him. He dipped his finger again and wrote, in uneven letters, "Still here." Alina blinked back tears. "That's perfect." She returned to the car that evening with streaks of paint still on her sweater, and Alexander, waiting in the passenger seat, looked at her and smiled. "You look like you've been in a war zone," he joked gently. "Maybe I have," she said, laughing softly, "but the good kind." Then she grew quiet. "There's a lot of pain out there, Alex, but there's also so much resilience. I used to think one person couldn't change much, but now I see it differently." He turned toward her. "Now you believe one person can?" "No," she said. "Now I know it takes 2. And though she was smiling, there was something behind her eyes, something deeper, a thought she hadn't shared yet, a memory maybe, or a longing. Back at headquarters that night, Alina stayed late. She walked the quiet halls, touched the shadow box gently, and stood for a long time in the doorway of the new children's story room, a cozy space with beanbags, shelves of books, and a wall of stars, each with a child's name. She wasn't sure when the tears began. Maybe it was the quiet, or maybe it was the letter, or the boy's green handprint, but she allowed them to come, because sometimes changing the world starts not with action, but with feeling it all. And in the silence of that night, she whispered into the room, "I see you, all of you." Outside, the snowfall deepened. Inside, the mission did too. And a story that had started with a doll was about to reach a place none of them had imagined. Asterisk, it had been exactly 1 year since the first mural was painted. 1 year since a child's trembling hand marked a wall with the words "Still Here." And tonight, the once small movement had blossomed into a nationwide initiative. Dozens of hospitals, hundreds of volunteers, thousands of handprints, each one a quiet anthem of survival, connection, and courage. Alina stood backstage at the community center where the anniversary event was being held. The main hall was packed, families, doctors, nurses, even mayors and local news crews. But Alina wasn't thinking about the cameras or speeches. Her mind was with the girl who had first reminded her what bravery looked like. Lily. She hadn't seen her since that night in room 304. She'd heard updates. Of course, Lily's surgery had been successful, her recovery steady. But as things grew busier, their lives had drifted in different directions, as they often do. Now, backstage, Alina gripped a folded piece of paper. Her palms were damp, not from nerves, from the weight of everything it had taken to get here. Alexander peeked in from the side curtain. "We're up in 5, he said with a smile that had become less corporate and more human with every passing month. She nodded, but didn't move. He stepped closer. "You okay?" She looked at him and finally exhaled. "I'm just remembering how it all started. 1 girl, 1 doll, 1 night. It felt so small at the time. But it wasn't," he said softly. "It was everything." The lights dimmed in the hall. A quiet hush spread across the audience like a tide receding. Alina stepped forward as the MC announced her name. She walked slowly onto the stage. Applause filled the air, but she barely heard it. Her eyes scanned the front rows until she saw something that stopped her breath. A little girl with curly dark hair and sparkling eyes, sitting beside her father, clutching a doll. The doll, faded pink dress, button-eye Lily. Alina stood at the podium, heart pounding. She unfolded the paper but didn't read it. Instead, she looked up. "I prepared a speech," she began, "but I think what matters most tonight isn't written down." The room fell completely still. "I once stayed past my shift to sit with a child who was too afraid to sleep. I gave her my childhood doll, something I had held onto through my own darkest nights. I thought I was just offering comfort, but what I didn't know then was that moment would become the seed of something far bigger than I ever imagined." She paused, her voice thick with emotion. "We live in a world where so many people walk past pain without looking, where silence fills hospital rooms, where loneliness lingers longer than medicine. But you, everyone in this room, you chose to stay, to show up, to hold hands, to believe that even small kindnesses can echo louder than fear." She turned slightly toward the audience, catching Lily's gaze. "There's a little girl in this room who taught me that courage isn't loud. Sometimes it's just holding on to something soft and letting yourself believe in the morning." Lily grinned. Jonathan reached over and gently touched his daughter's shoulder. "And now," Alina continued, "I want to introduce you to someone who changed my life in a way I never expected." A spotlight moved to the aisle as Lily rose from her seat. The audience erupted in applause, not just because she was walking to the stage, but because everyone felt the significance of this moment, of how something as simple as a gift could shift the course of many lives. Lily stood beside Alina, who knelt to her level. "You look so strong," Alina whispered, tears now openly falling. Lily held up the doll and smiled. "She stayed with me. I think it's time I give her to someone else now." The entire hall grew silent. Lily reached into her pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. She handed it to Alina. "Can you find someone who needs her?" Alina took the doll and the note gently, like sacred things. "I promise." Later that night, after the event, Alina sat quietly in her office. The doll rested on the desk. The note was still in her hand. She unfolded it slowly. "Give it to someone brave who forgot they were." She helped them remember. It wasn't just a child's handwriting. It was a torch being passed. That night, as snow fell gently outside, Alina walked to the children's ward at the hospital closest to the event. She asked the night nurse if there was anyone having trouble sleeping. A boy, maybe 5, had just come out of surgery. He hadn't spoken all day. Alina entered the dim room softly. The boy looked up, startled. "Hi," she said. "I brought you someone who's helped a lot of kids sleep through scary nights." She placed the doll gently beside him. "She's not magic," she said, "but she knows how to stay." The boy said nothing, just looked at the doll, then at her, then back at the doll. And then, for the first time since his surgery, he spoke. "Can she stay with me?" Alina smiled, her heart full. "As long as you need." She turned off the light, letting the moonlight spill across the bed, and as she stepped into the hallway, the night felt warmer somehow. The kind of warmth that didn't come from heaters or blankets but from a promise kept. From a story that had no ending, only new beginnings. Because sometimes, one gift, given in love, becomes the thread that stitches 1,000 hearts together. And still, across cities and wards and snowy nights, the doll stayed quiet, soft, and full of the kind of magic that lives only in those who choose to care.